Before he was a meme, before he was a punchline on Saturday Night Live, and long before a pizza chain put his face on a to-go box, Gumby was just a green lump of clay with a wire skeleton inside him and a schoolteacher's fingerprints all over his body. He didn't walk so much as get rebuilt, over and over, frame by frame, by a man who was chasing something a lot more personal than a kid's show. Today we're digging into 15 strange, true, and occasionally heartbreaking facts about the Gumby Show. The puppet who was destroyed every time he moved, the church that funded his comeback, and the Saturday Night Live sketch that turned him into a foul-mouthed, washed-up celebrity his own creator couldn't stop laughing at. Stick around, because by the end you'll understand why a green kid with a lopsided head became one of the strangest survival stories in television history. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We dig up one weird show business rabbit hole every single week. Gumby wasn't built for children. He was built for a film class. In 1953, a USC student named Art Clokey was studying under Slavko Vorkapik, a montage theorist obsessed with what he called the kinesthetic effect, using rhythm and motion to hit an audience on a level below conscious thought. For his class project, Clokey shot a 3-minute short called Gumbasia, a wordless parade of shapeless clay blobs pulsing and morphing to a jazz score, deliberately built as a loose, clay-based riff on Disney's Fantasia. There was no green boy in it, no horse sidekick, just formless clay obeying the beat of the music. It wasn't meant for a network, a sponsor, or a single child. It was meant to earn Clokey a grade. Instead, it became the technical seed of an entire television character, because a few years later, that same experiment landed in front of exactly the wrong, or right person. The man who saw Gumbasia was Sam Engel, a producer at 20th Century Fox. Clokey had gotten close to Engel almost by accident, tutoring one of Engel's relatives, and Engel eventually asked to see the strange little clay film his tutor kept talking about. He liked it enough to push Clokey to build actual characters out of the technique, figures that could tell stories to children instead of just melting into shapes. Clokey agreed, built early puppet tests, and when the pitch eventually reached NBC and turned into a real contract, Engel wanted nothing from it. No producer credit, no royalty cut, no ownership stake. He just wanted to see something worthwhile on children's television, and once he'd nudged Clokey toward the network, he stepped back entirely. It's a strange kind of a footnote in TV history. An executive who helped launch a decade-spanning franchise and never once tried to attach his name to it. Art Clokey's childhood was rough enough to be its own story. His parents split when he was young, and when he was 9 years old, his biological father was killed in a car accident. Clokey was eventually adopted by a composer named Joseph Clokey and took his name. Decades later, when he was designing the silhouette of his clay hero, he gave the character an odd, asymmetrical lump on one side of the head, a detail he explained a few different ways over the years, from a practical need to break up an awkward shape, to a nod at the wisdom bump seen on certain Buddhist figures. But later in life, he also connected it to a family photograph, a portrait of his biological father as a young man, with a stubborn cowlick that wouldn't lie flat. Whatever the mix of reasons actually was, the most recognizable head in stop-motion television carries a quiet trace of a father Clokey lost before he was 10. Clay animation has a brutal, unglamorous secret. The material that makes the character bendable is the same material working against him. Every time animators posed Gumby into a new position for a single frame, the clay stretched, thinned, and lost tiny amounts of its shape. Hot studio lighting made the clay even softer and less stable, forcing puppets off the set to cool and firm back up before they could be used again. That meant Gumby wasn't one continuous puppet lasting through an entire episode. He was a rotating cast of nearly identical clay bodies, sculpted around a bendable wire skeleton that had to be swapped in and touched up constantly just to keep his proportions consistent from shot to shot. The calm, unbothered character on screen was off-screen, being quietly rebuilt again and again just to survive being animated at all. In September of 1955, a children's TV host named Pinky Lee was doing his usual high-energy bit on live television when he suddenly grabbed at his throat, called out for help, and collapsed in front of the cameras. The studio audience, made up mostly of kids trained to cheer at his antics, kept right on applauding, assuming it was part of the act. It wasn't. Lee had collapsed from exhaustion and a severe sinus infection. not a heart attack. But the rumor that he'd died on the air spread fast and refused to die itself. Newspapers ran items about the late Pinky Lee for years afterward, sometimes while he was actively performing in the same city. Lee's own children's show never fully recovered from the incident, but in 1957, he got a second chance, stepping in to host the Fun Shop wraparound segments on the freshly launched Gumby Show. A strange little redemption arc for a man half of America assumed was already gone. Clokey had actually studied at a seminary before he ever picked up a movie camera, and his first wife, Ruth, had grown up as a minister's daughter who worked in religious education. So when the United Lutheran Church in America decided to fund a brand new children's television show from scratch in the late 1950s, Clokey wasn't some random outsider getting a surprise call. He was, in a sense, exactly the kind of collaborator the church was hoping to find. The result was Davy and Goliath, a stop-motion series about a boy and his talking dog that used the same clay techniques as Gumby to explore fairness, grief, and right and wrong in a Sunday morning time slot built for kids in pajamas. It became Clokey's other long-running legacy, running for years and eventually getting revived decades later, including a strange afterlife as the star of a soda commercial, of all things. In the 1990s, a Pennsylvania kid nicknamed Pokey got a domain name, Pokey.org, as a birthday present from his dad. Not long after, the company holding the Pokey trademark sent the family a cease and desist letter, not because of any actual conflict, but because a corporate trademark holder was leaning on a private citizen who happened to share a nickname with a cartoon pony. The backlash was loud enough that when the U.S. Senate wrote the Anti-Cybersquatting Consumer Protection Act the following year, the committee report specifically cited Pokey.org as an example of a domain that should never be targeted under the new law, a private nickname registered in good faith, not an attempt to profit off someone else's trademark. A 12-year-old with a birthday present ended up quietly shaping how American law defines cybersquatting for a huge chunk of the American public. The Gumby they actually remember isn't the gentle 1950s original. It's Eddie Murphy, in full costume, growling out lines as a bitter, cigar-chomping has been on Saturday Night Live, starting in 1982. The sketch reportedly grew out of a writer's room conversation about old children's shows that drifted from Davy and Goliath over to Gumby, with Murphy improvising the idea of playing him as a washed-up celebrity looking back on a ruined career. It could have easily turned into a legal headache for a character built around wholesome, gentle storytelling. Instead, by most accounts, Art Clokey embraced it, reportedly delighted that a raunchy parody was pushing Gumby merchandise back onto store shelves decades after the original show had ended. Few creators get to watch their gentlest character reborn as a foul-mouthed celebrity parody and consider it a career highlight, but Clokey more or less did. The original Gumby show ran on NBC, with Tootsie Roll as its sponsor, but by November of 1957 the network pulled the plug. Most creators in that position, in that era, would have walked away. The network usually kept the rights to whatever it had financed, and that was that. Clokey didn't walk away. He went out and reacquired ownership of Gumby, Pokey, and the rest of the cast, taking a canceled show's cast of characters and turning them into something he personally controlled rather than something that would simply sit unused in a network vault. That single decision is the reason there was anything left to revive in the 1960s, to syndicate through the 1980s, to build a feature film around in 1995, or to eventually sell as a full franchise decades later. Without that buyback, Gumby likely ends as a 2-year 1950s curiosity instead of a character with a 70-year afterlife. In 1985, 2 University of Florida finance majors, Chance Hippler and Jeff O'Brien, dropped out of school to open a pizza shop in Gainesville. O'Brien's nickname, earned from refusing to stop wearing a green tracksuit, happened to be Gumby, and the pair leaned into the coincidence hard enough to name the whole restaurant after it. The following year, they struck a licensing deal directly with Art Clokey, and Gumby's Pizza was born as an official, character-branded chain rather than a trademark accident waiting to happen. Decades later, it's grown into a multi-state late-night pizza chain built almost entirely around college towns, selling breadstick-style Pokey Sticks, named after Gumby's horse. Proof that one of the character's longest-running and most profitable afterlives has nothing to do with television at all, and everything to do with a green tracksuit and a bad nickname that stuck. Long before computer animation existed as a mainstream idea, Clokey had already built an entire aesthetic around inanimate material coming to life the moment a camera started rolling. That's essentially the founding trick of clay animation itself. His feature film, Gumby, the movie, hit theaters in October of 1995 on a modest budget and, by most reported accounts, an even more modest box office return. A single month later, Toy Story opened, reshaped the entire animation industry with computer-generated toys that also secretly lived their own lives when nobody was watching, and became one of the defining films of the decade. Two projects built on strikingly similar emotional logic, produced with wildly different tools, released weeks apart. One using clay and wire that had been Clokey's signature since the early 1950s, the other using rendering technology that was brand new to audiences. History remembers one of them as a groundbreaking blockbuster and largely forgot the other, even though the older one had been quietly working the same idea by hand for over 40 years. Art Clokey's son, Joe, didn't grow up planning to run a clay animation studio. He built an early interest in horticulture, studied it in college, worked in native plant advocacy, and ran a business distributing educational films about agriculture. Then, in 2010, his father died in his sleep, and Joe, known for most of his life simply as Gumby's little brother in family circles, stepped into running the family company alongside his wife. Rather than chasing a big flashy reboot, he spent years acting mostly as a caretaker, remastering the original footage, running exhibits, showing up at conventions, and eventually co-writing a detailed book about his father's life and career. He wasn't trying to reinvent Gumby. He was trying to make sure the original work didn't quietly disappear. Joe Clokey published that book on his father's life and work in late 2017. Just a few months later, in March of 2018, he died of cardiac arrest at only 56 years old. Less than 4 years after that, in early 2022, Fox Entertainment acquired the entire Gumby franchise, film, television, streaming, and merchandising rights, directly from Joe's estate, with plans to relaunch the character for a new generation of viewers. It's a strange, almost cruelly tidy piece of timing. The son who spent nearly a decade quietly protecting his father's life's work passed away right before that same work was handed off to a major media company, meaning neither Clokey, father or son, was around to see the character's next chapter begin. When Fox Entertainment announced the Gumby acquisition, the company didn't just want the old footage sitting quietly in an archive. Executives explicitly framed the purchase as a way to reimagine the character for streaming, new animated and live-action projects, and merchandising far beyond what a converted garage clay studio in the 1950s could have imagined. It's a genuinely odd endpoint for a character who started life as an unpaid film school assignment shot by a former seminary student. From a homemade experiment with no commercial ambitions at all, to a show funded on a shoestring NBC budget, to a fully corporate-owned piece of intellectual property being positioned for 21st century platforms that didn't exist for most of Gumby's actual lifespan. Art Clokey died in 2010. Joe Clokey died in 2018. Pinky Lee, the man forever associated with surviving his own on-air death, passed away decades ago too. And yet the character all of them helped shape has kept moving through pop culture almost the entire time. Parodied on Saturday Night Live, licensed onto pizza boxes, cited in federal law, folded into a Google-era internet joke about a 12-year-old's website, and finally absorbed into a major studio's modern content library. A green clay figure with no fixed shape has, somehow, ended up as one of the more durable characters in American television history, mostly because everyone who ever got close to him, a producer who wanted no credit, a church looking for something decent for kids, a comedian doing a bitter impression, a pizza-loving college dropout, a horticulturist son who just wanted to protect his dad's legacy, kept choosing, for their own very different reasons, to keep him bending instead of letting him break.